Michelle?
Daniel,
OG
OG
Rose?
Rose, and notice what in the background is different. Like in the 90s, those Seek and Finds,
Yeah.
those books. Yeah. Remember the 90s? The 90s.
Did they have a title? There was some series they had,
Was it
but
like
they
the
were,
library books? It started with an S. Is that what you're talking about? Like we had to like find
yeah, you just
things?
every page you'd flip and it would just be kind of like
A
this,
scene.
yeah,
Yeah,
like
yeah, yeah. I
not like
saw
a
like a
menagerie, but like a just,
documentary of he would like design these things. They
mm,
were kind of artistic and
mm,
pretty. Started with an S.
mhm.
Um, what are you thinking about?
Well, I've been thinking about a couple of different things. I guess a question has been percolating in my mind um, about what does it mean to be lukewarm.
Mm,
Um,
mm,
like that concept is
mm,
well, I have known it and been I was introduced to that concept through scripture, through Christianity.
mm,
And um, I guess I've just been wondering about how to understand the concept of being lukewarm
mm.
in our modern age or from different perspectives, or what are you being like if you're being lukewarm, what are you being lukewarm to? Um, I mean, there's also the question of church because um, and I guess that there's okay, so one paradigm could be, well, if you're not committed to a particular church, then you're being lukewarm,
Right,
right? But scripture doesn't say that.
right.
Now, it might be implying that,
Sure.
but it seems to be talking more so about one's allegiance. I mean, the way I always thought about it as growing up was kind of this idea of kind of being half in, half out with, do I want to like actually follow God or not, right? Do I
Mhm,
actually want to fully give my life over
mhm.
to God or not? So, but yeah, I mean, I think it would be interesting to think about that term, that concept of being lukewarm. First of all, some people might not know what that concept is, but so just to think about what does it mean to be lukewarm, but then also how does it apply more broadly to life itself, to faith, yes, and then also to life itself. So that's one thing I've been thinking about. Um,
Hmm.
and who does decide? Is it
Yeah.
something that you should just decide, or that or should somebody else be able to decide that? Because we don't have as many givens, um, you can choose certain givens that would then be that would be the standard, would make the standard for to determine by
Yeah.
which you are lukewarm or not. So yeah, there's a lot of questions there that my brain gets into with that, and I do think that yeah, there's some interesting questions it can bring up for me as it relates to yielding fully to the creative process. Like we talked a bit about writing on the last nut. And so I do think about that too, where, yeah, like a lot, people could view indecision as lukewarmness, but usually every indecision is also a decision to something else.
Mm,
And so that's another thing that's important to me is that kind of like when we were talking about the constraints topic, like every constraint, every uh yeah, everything that, like, even if we think about the concept of like self-expression, you'd still need to have yourself, like, to be able to do the work of self-expressing, you have to start asking yourself, what does it mean to self-express? So a definition for self-expression is, it's true that there might be, they probably do in some ways contradict each other, but at the same time there is a way in which constraints at some, like, on a more fundamental level are always at play with the unfolding and the saturation and the access, like we talked about, and self-expression, right? But like if you don't have an, if you're not clear with yourself about what it means, like if you don't have, in a sense, a constraint, I don't say like limited, but you have to have some limitation around what it means to self-express. Otherwise you could start getting paranoid about, I'm not self-expressing
yeah.
enough,
Yeah. Yeah.
and
Yeah.
then I feel like
Yeah.
I don't even know, like it's not even helping you
Yeah.
anymore, the thing
Yeah.
that's
Yeah.
supposed to be
Yeah.
helping
Yeah.
you. So, um, anyway, I'm just trying to say that that's a play, I think, too, with indecision and decision,
Yes.
because a lot of
Yeah.
times, too,
Yeah.
indecision is either somebody else thinks you're being indecisive or you feel like you're being indecisive, but usually your indecision reveals a type of decision to something else. And, if that something else is not as identifiable because it's not on the map per se of what, like, is the script, societal script, that decision to something else doesn't look like it's not intelligible to anybody, and it's not recognizable to anybody. So, yeah, there's a lot in that arena that I've been thinking about. But one last thing, and it's
Yeah,
kind of
yeah,
disconnected, but as we've been talking about the convivial renaissance with Illich and the SCM, the social coordination mechanism, seeing the internet so differently, I really do feel like I get a window into seeing social imagination and its real effects in real time through women in certain containers, as they might be called. See,
yeah,
constrain, right? Like
right.
but in this container, there's this plethora of like real change that women are experiencing. And I'm talking about it specifically with Corey Malloy and her container, um, which is really focused on kind of a mitochondrial energy and, you know, I don't want to reduce it to this because it's not merely this, but biohabits and things like that. You're in touchness with your own resourcing and like your capacity, etc. Really good stuff. Highly recommend for especially for women, but men can really benefit from it too, of course. Um, but anyways, what I'm trying to say is that it's really cool because it's a way to actually see people sharing their like real-time experiences with implementing shifts in their mindset in their like habits, and then showing like some radical changes that are occurring for them that are even physical, right? Like they're desiring whatever it is, like just all the like, and when you get to actually see like before and after photos or like testimonials or like there's all this kind of, it feeds, wow, it's possible, right?
Mhm,
Like this social imagination shows you it's possible.
mhm,
Oh my gosh, I can actually impact my reality. I'm more powerful than I thought I was, or
mhm.
whatever it is. um oh wow, I'm more of a contributing factor to the thing I'm complaining about than I thought I was, all these types of things. So anyway, I mean, to me, I guess I'm just bringing that up because I see that as a really strong example of uh, basically what, like, kind of a testing ground for certain ideas and seeing like how is it actually making people's lives better, how are they being like impacted by it, and it all came from, you know essentially a social coordination mechanism of, because even information dissemination is a type of social
Oh, yeah,
coordination mechanism.
absolutely.
And so yeah, I just think that's really, really, really fascinating, and I think it's a case study. I guess I'm just trying to say that, like, there could be, it would, to me, it would be interesting and maybe helpful to people if they knew, like, case studies of what do you mean by, like, a social
Yeah,
coordination mechanism?
sure, sure,
Now, you
sure.
could contest, or somebody could contest that, say these containers that I'm talking about, that, Vessel Village or Rooted Families, like that, they could say, oh, those aren't really the social coordination mechanism, and here's why. But for me, the social coordination mechanism as, again, as a training ground for encountering, not only encountering difference, but encountering yourself more deeply for the sake of your own change and greater capacity to engage with difference, to engage with your actual lived life and
Mhm.
lived relations, is important. And I see it so evidently. Like, again, it could be challenged, but for me, I see it so evidently as an example of that.
Oh, yeah. Oh, yeah.
And at the core of it is a lot of actually philosophical work.
Mhm.
um, it's put right in line with the tangibilities of, like, yeah, your space does matter, and yeah, where you how you posture your body matters, all of those things. So um how you think matters. So anyways, the long and the short of it is, those are the things I'm thinking about.
Well, I mean,
Thank you for asking.
no, that's, I mean, to on the that is definitely social coordination
Mhm,
work, and it should be noted that before the costs of, say, showing those case studies or those different communities came down, because it's far cheaper now to record and post and etc., then simply the costs of doing so would have been so high, especially when you're talking about things like you're talking about, which are harder to quantify. They're qualitative in people's
yeah,
lives.
exactly.
Therefore, it's harder to get out to people without having to, say, them pay to come to a session or something. So the
Hmm.
money had to leave, but it's like, well, what am I paying for? So the amount of people willing to do it would go down. So when you start talking about, so the main point is, we now, something the social coordination mechanism does is make it far easier to have windows into different ways of life quickly, and to kind of see things that then maybe you could say that when you have certain services that are more like modes of being, you need to see the qualitative results first and then you pay. which if in the past it was more likely that you had to pay and then do the
Mm,
qualitative results, or maybe they could give you a sample, but maybe one sample when you really need 100 or so to really kind of see the effects over time. That's going to open coordination possibilities that weren't possible before.
mhm,
And I do think if Illich is right with his book on shadow work, I think a lot of shadow work, quote unquote, work that the economy requires that isn't given wages. He'll talk about playing guitar to entertain people after a meal, or obviously housework, or
mhm,
sitting in traffic, you could say, is a kind of labor. So, like the point he's making in shadow work is there's all of this work that is quote unquote in the shadows that actually makes wage labor possible.
mm,
Like it is not the case that the work the society needs is all paid for. There's a huge amount of work that makes society paid for, that makes society possible, that is not paid for.
mhm,
And, one of his points is that that is a kind of discrimination or a kind of othering that is not good for the society and will lead to inefficiencies. Now, you could say those inefficiencies tend to look like people in marriages feeling repressed or people being upset at job. Like they're not, those inefficiencies aren't going to be reflected by the market, but will be reflected in people's quality of life.
yeah,
And there
which
is
then could impact the
Oh,
market,
yeah,
no?
I think it would trickle,
Mhm,
but there are certainly ways that social coordination can more effectively deal with shadow work, to actually bring into acknowledgement, not because receiving wages is what validates work, we're not saying that, but the problem is you get into a world where you come to feel as if it doesn't receive payment, it's not real,
mm,
right? There's this kind of tiered system. But in fact, to kind of expand our scope of different values,
mhm,
like different value forms,
yeah,
telling a story after dinner has value even if you're not paid for it,
yeah,
right? But
yeah,
it's harder to think that when you are trained by habit in the system to basically associate real work with receiving wages.
mhm,
And it's going to take a lot of time to train us out of that assumption. But, the case that Illich is pointing to is if you can make a strong case that the work that receives wages wouldn't be possible without all of the work that doesn't receive wages, then that realization could start to at least begin to open you up to see value in these things that have been shadow work or have been not acknowledged for a
mm,
long time. And you could say this work that many women are doing to find different modes of being, different modes of health, is a
mhm,
kind of work that has been difficult to acknowledge or
yes,
to see that now it's beginning to be seen, and that changes a lot. And that I think ultimately can be tied to the lukewarm question, which is
mm,
a
mm,
fascinating. I mean, it is very interesting as you ask that. Um, it's one of those things that seemingly everyone knows what it is, but if you actually ask, well, what is it? It's like Plato asking, well, what's justice?
exactly.
Socrates asking, what is justice, right? So, what is lukewarmness?
Mhm,
Um, well, I think typically people associate it with going through the motions and not
mm,
really meaning it.
right,
I think people can mean a lack of passion. There's a lack of passion. I think it can get associated with Kierkegaardian Christendom versus
mhm,
Christianity. Um, But it's interesting to think through it. I think it's also tied to constraint because there's something about lukewarmness that sounds like you're not constrained. Like you're not bound by if you're bound by something, that's lukewarmness. So there's something about not being lukewarm that I think people associate with not being constrained. But actually that may destroy the possibilities of doing something of significance, culture making or something like that.
mhm,
So,
mhm, mhm,
I guess the first thoughts that come to mind on it is seemingly to me, I guess, what maybe a way to think about lukewarmness. Because if lukewarmness, if not being lukewarm equals like being being on fire for Jesus or something on fire,
sorry, what was that?
on fire for
What's
Jesus.
what's the part if it means that or if it
Yeah,
doesn't
if
mean
it
that?
means that,
If being lukewarm
not being
not being
lukewarm,
okay, yeah,
then it runs the risk of performatism,
right,
and that can create anxiety in the Christian, where they're always wanting to say talk about Christianity or talk about something so that you don't think that they are lukewarm. But the same
mhm,
can happen to anything. Like, you want to prove to your boss that you really care about work, so you get the promotion, so you enter a kind of performance, right? So there's a risk to, and then perhaps you as well enter a certain sort of performance to convince yourself you're not lukewarm. because the Christian can be scared to death that they're lukewarm. And, the Christian might just be trying to pay their bills 9 to 5 and then like, "Oh, what if I'm lukewarm?" And that's a problem, right?
Yeah.
And so I think the fear of being lukewarm can lead to a lot of, kind of a split in the subject where they kind of feel guilty for maybe just raising a family and doing their job and doing the best they
Mhm.
can, which if there's none of those people, typically in Christian churches, the missionaries get associated with not being lukewarm, but they wouldn't have any money without the people doing the 9 to 5, right? So I do think the concept of lukewarm has been underthought. I think it is just a kind of vague concept that, and I focus on Christians here because, like, that's where the term lukewarm
Yeah.
comes up the most.
Mhm.
And I think many Christians, it's a term that's not explored enough.
Yeah, well, I just first of all, it kind of makes me wonder what the Greek word was
Sure,
for that. But
sure,
also
sure.
it makes me think about like, okay, so if we slow down and think about lukewarm water, because so it being in that type of time period, it almost makes me think that it's almost something about it not being fresh, right? Because like if it's just from a stream or
Yeah,
something, it's like very
yeah,
cold or
yeah,
cool,
yeah.
and then if it was boiled for whatever their
Mhm,
purification or
mhm.
whatever it was to, like it would be hot, it would be it would be warm, and you um and so there's something about like I guess I'm trying to derive the idea that maybe it's implying that lukewarm is to be stagnant,
I mean, it's interesting because you don't typically warm something to lukewarm. You warm it to boiling, and then
but
it
then you
becomes
wait till it's
lukewarm. So it's a term that suggests there was a passion that went away. There was a
hmm,
passion that
exactly,
was
yeah.
there, but then it kind of went away. You don't tend to warm something to lukewarm. It typically is something where you're all in and not. But then again, it can be a term that means you just kind of offhandedly heard about something and joined it, but didn't really change your life. Lukewarm seems to suggest a was not aware of the full implications and haven't given yourself over to the thing fully.
Yeah.
It's some sort of, like you said, foot in, foot
Mhm.
out.
Well, yeah, I mean, the risk of, and there could be there are a lot of risks with how it could be interpreted, as you were saying, that could lead to somebody being again kind of almost paranoid about like,
Yep.
am I this? Am I, like the fear can come in, um, but you can also just not think about it and be like, well, I know I'm not lukewarm because
Yeah.
whatever
You
I'm.
look for signifiers.
Yeah, and then you're kind of like, then you just don't ask the question anymore. So I do think like there's something
Mhm.
important about asking the question, but I also don't think you should, yeah, obviously being paranoid about it and paralyzed by it is also not ideal. Um,
Well, I think a danger here is I do think Christians can look for markers of being Christian to avoid the fear of being lukewarm.
1000%. And this is
Yes.
where, to me, so there's two things that are coming to mind. One is that, again, so what I was saying on like a potential risk of interpretation of it is to almost encourage like vehemency, right? Where
Yep.
people are like, well, if I'm not, whatever it is, if I'm not being like,
Adamant.
yeah, basically, if I'm not being adamant, or if I'm not telling every single person I meet out on my errands about, like if I don't do
Yep.
an altar call with them at the cashier register, like I'm not, like I must not really believe what I say.
Yeah, and
And
that's what I mean by the performatism.
right.
There's a certain performance,
Hmm.
a certain level of performance you have to maintain. Right.
Right. So there's kind of the hot, cold, hot. Because again, what
Yep.
if it's not lukewarm? It's either hot, right, or it's cold. And so um, there's something about that idea of like, yeah, being hot or cold could be reactivity essentially, right,
Absolutely.
and performativity. But there's also something I don't right now. Like I'm thinking now about something that I read in one of I think it was a professor's essay talking about um, Nishanti and Hegel. But basically, they were saying something about the fact that like hot and cold always have the root of temperature, right? This is
Yes.
like so. And so what I think what's interesting is like perhaps what's important about not being lukewarm is that you do keep the dialectic always at play actually, and
Hmm.
maybe the um what's the word, admonishment, if you will, though that's a little strong, to not be lukewarm. Well, it is kind of an admonishment in the scriptures, but is to sort of say to not be dialect, to be on your guard, not to ignore actually the dialectical between the cold and the hot.
Right.
Not that you become, oh, I'm just like cold, 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 or hot, hot, hot about this stuff, but like though somebody could argue with what we're saying and say no, like it's all about being hot, vehement. But the thing is, you have to ask the question of like, what are the fruits of your vehemency? Like, what
Yep.
is the quality of your relations and your quality of even if your goal is conversion, your quality of conversion, if you will, in being vehement. You know what I mean? So,
Yes.
and also
But
the
if you take the logic, I didn't mean to
no, no,
interrupt,
no.
but there's an issue because you're completely correct in everything you're getting at with the Christian. But there's an argument you can make that unless you're a monk in the desert, then you're lukewarm. Like by that logic, right?
Well, who
Like it,
decide again?
yeah,
Like
who
who
decides,
decides,
right?
right?
I think the lukewarm issue creates a real a real anxiety for, say, the American Christian in a suburbia with a family.
Definitely.
Because you feel just by not basically being a monk, and this is where I think many young Christians like, well, I better not be married, I better be single, because if I'm married, it's actually somehow less Christian than being single. You get all of that nervousness as well. But I think basically if you start going, well, if because okay, so you've spent 3 hours watching a football match or FIFA or something. Well, you're lukewarm. Why not? Like, even if you spend every other hour of that week on the sidewalk preaching the gospel, why wouldn't if you really believe that Jesus was the Son of God and that people were going to hell, then why would you let yourself watch a football game for 3 hours?
Mm.
And if you say something like, "Because I was tired," is that an excuse? We're talking eternal damnation here. You see how
Yeah,
it
yeah, yeah.
can keep going.
Well, exactly, and that's where I think that's the interpretation that is focusing merely on the what and not the how, not the being.
Yeah.
Because
Mhm,
if we go back to it being about temperature,
mhm.
then um, the interpretation that to me sort of makes the most sense because I think it helps address the perpetual fractalization of of who interprets and what the interpretation is of being hot enough or
Yeah,
cold enough
right, exactly.
is to understand that it's a mode of being, if you want to say, on fire for life itself,
Yeah. Sure,
right? Or
sure.
being able to be cool, if you want to think about the other things associated with cold or cool, of being like calm, in a sense, almost like being able to practice healthy non-attachment, like all of the things that like kind of might be more associated with cool,
Yes.
or being able to be refreshing, right? Like that you should be able to participate in your being and in your mode of how you live out your faith and know, understand, and experience God, and then share that with the world, to be able to be that in your, like, to experience that and be that in your being of temperature of
Sure,
y-
but then you run the risk is, or the suggestion would be, it is possible that to the degree a person is not lukewarm could be to the degree they look lukewarm because it is more integrated into a kind
that's
of
what
Kierkegaardian night of faith.
but that's the thing. I
Yes.
think that's the real, I guess that's why the topic has been on my mind and is interesting to me. It's because I think there is a lot of, well, when I think there's a lot of confusion and fear, and there can also be a lot of self, like, you have to, in a sense, like, I think there is a part of it where you're trying to cultivate a sense of self trust in the decisions that you feel, in that place that might be called the knower, or like the place of
Uh-huh.
your full kind of like, actually the self trust would be your full union with God, essentially, really,
Yeah,
like,
but the Christian will say you're self-deceived and you just
yeah,
told
yeah, yeah,
yourself that
sure.
and you're fallen. How can you trust your
Yeah, yeah,
nature and
yeah,
blah
yeah.
blah blah. But yes, but I don't disagree with what you're gesturing toward, but there's a real problem. There's a real tension in Christian culture
Absolutely.
with this matter.
I think so.
I mean
I
there's a few things. I don't think this is what the term lukewarm means in the book of Revelation, but I think you can see with many Christians, what we'll talk often about bursting, where there's this kind of like bursting into action because you want to change. Like you can even think about like you put something off, put it and then burst into action. You see, I think in many Christians a kind of burstiness to their being, where because there is these various nervousnesses of not being Christian enough, or what if I'm failing, or what if this person is going to hell, but then you're also
Mhm,
just trying to pay your bills, trying to get to the kids in the car, and there can be this kind of
mhm,
burstiness,
mhm.
and that needs to be described more. But I think fears of being lukewarm leads to burstiness.
But maybe that's as it should be, because burstiness makes me think of combustion, which makes me think of hot, which makes me think of
I
not
think
lukewarm.
burstiness I think a bursty way of being is a manner that a subject can be to itself to feel like it's not lukewarm, precisely because it feels like you're so hot. Because look, you just combust.
Yeah.
But the thing I think you're pointing to is that the proper response to lukewarmness should not be burstiness. It is something more stable. It is something more
Mm,
consistent.
mm,
But then the problem is many Christian ways of making sure they're not lukewarm, you could argue, are not stable. Or they're
Mm.
going to, or it's going to inevitably lead to self-selection to just be around people like you who accept your worldview. It's going to hurt. It's going to hurt your pluralistic involvement, which
Sure.
you could argue, if you're trying to spread the gospel, is extremely important because you
Yeah.
don't want to just be around people like you,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
And I think many Christians' way of being to make sure they're not lukewarm can be alienating to people who are not Christian, for example. And they can then avoid the Christian. They say, well, the world's going to hate us, right? But the problem is it's a kind of self justifying logic for whatever results happen. If Christians do something that really is not effective and it doesn't work, then they can just say, well, the world will reject us. But that means they can never be wrong and they can never make a mistake. And
And they can never learn a
and they can
better
never learn a
way.
better
Yeah.
strategy,
Yeah.
if you will, and that can be very problematic. I do think, let me throw it to you, there's more to say, but I do think there's a burstiness in a lot of Christian culture to convince themselves they're not lukewarm because it feels like on fire. But I think this point applies more widely. I think artists will have bursts to feel like they're still true artists,
Oh,
right? They
100%.
don't
This is
move it into a discipline, or
yes.
people who feel like their true identity, they'll feel like, oh, I'm losing myself, and they'll have a burst of doing something for me, or I'm going to do something for me, and they have these bursting assertions of their
Mhm.
identity to make sure they're still themselves because they're nervous they're not anymore because they're 30 and they're caught up by responsibility. If you pay attention, many people have a kind of burstiness to them in how they do things, or they'll be really passionate about a certain project and they'll get really excited and they'll work it hard and then they forget about it 72 hours later, and then another week they burst back onto the scene to convince themselves they're not someone who's going to start something and not finish it. And the burstingness has a function of making the subject live with themselves in a certain quality.
Yeah, that's really good, Daniel, and that's important. And I think it's so human. It's so human to do such a thing. And it definitely comes from that like all or nothing
Yeah,
mentality. It
all or
comes of
nothing.
like a, well, let me catch up, let me make up for the,
Yeah.
for the times I wasn't doing anything. Now I want to do it all.
Yes.
Um, and I think the language may conceal that there's actually something that's lukewarm underneath all of that,
Yes.
because the language again sounds like, oh, I'm bursting, I'm combusting, I'm
Yes.
hot, I'm not
Yes.
lukewarm, right? But the lukewarm thing underneath is that you're not,
Your
because
average is lukewarm because you burst and nothing, burst and nothing. So you actually have a lukewarm average. It's kind of interesting because we don't tend to think about lukewarm as an average.
mm,
We think about it as an emotional display. And I
hmm
think that hurts because what you were suggesting earlier is there's something that needs to translate into daily life.
yes,
But I
exactly,
think there's a way we think about avoiding lukewarmness that actually contributes to that not occurring, because
absolutely.
we're performing to ourselves and to others.
Well, of course, and that's where, like, so that's where, okay, for example, though there, if you, the other thing is like, if you basically assure yourself I'm not lukewarm because you do all the externalities, like you do okay, so I do the things, right? I do the church things or the Christian things. um the risk there is that you're not cultivating the inner. You
Correct.
might be,
You
all
might
of
be.
those things might
Yes.
be and
Yes.
should be
Yes.
ultimately a cultivation of the inner self too, toward not being lukewarm.
You could
But
outsource
you
your inner
may be,
development to the external.
you might, and
Correct.
then, oh, but you do that so that you're not lukewarm.
Yes.
But then you may
Internally you
not
are.
be assessing
Yes.
how is that making me on my every, like in the quietest of moments.
Yes.
What am I doing? Like how is it affecting then? How is it impacting my relations then? How is it impacting my disposition then? And I think relations might be particularly unique litmus test, because for to yourself, you could just feel fine or be it's
Sure.
fine, or you know and maybe like to say, well, that's not fair because people are complicated. That's true, but also we are in relation, and like the whole idea of the scripture talking about lukewarmness is in reference to a relation to God, right? So
Sure.
it's there's some, like, what I mean to say is there's like a relational quality that I think is off can be potentially overlooked in the outsourcing, in the externalizing of the work to not be lukewarm, that
Yes.
is important, and again might feel like, well, that doesn't have anything to do with it. It's just my personal decision to follow God, and that's really all that it's about. Somebody might say that, but for me, it's like But what is that to actually what does that actually mean then for your lived experience for like again those the very quiet moments or the interaction with your spouse or your friend or your
Well, I mean,
colleague or
only
how you talk to yourself in private or whatever it is, you know?
People can know,
Yeah,
and
sure,
of
sure.
course, it's extremely dangerous to start talking about a Christianity that doesn't need church or community
Oh
because
yeah,
you
100%.
formulate in some sort of vague spirituality that serves yourself and, heresy or whatever, right?
Yeah.
Well, there's also a few things. I mean, the letters in Revelation are talking to entire churches.
Mm,
So
mhm,
it is it's not so much individuals. So
mm,
there's something about the idea that you were lukewarm, and it is interesting because I do think many Christians associate lukewarm with church, actually, with a collective activity that becomes stale. It's just going through the motions.
mm.
But then there's something about the individual, like, so you have the church where it seems like you have a thread of lukewarmness. And of course, it blurs because the people who go to church go home as individuals
Yeah.
shaped by the church. So they're lukewarm in that sense because there's a way in which the word lukewarm does seem, and again, I'm not sure what the Greek, the particular term is, blah, blah, blah. But I think nevertheless, the points we're getting at are valid. There is a suggestion that lukewarmness comes from a certain offloading of inner development to something external, and then the inner development doesn't occur, which I believe you're pointing to.
Mhm.
So, but then, of course, if you're not in community, you run the risk of heresy or becoming intellectually unintelligible to
Or
others, or
hikikimori.
hikikomori, or overstating your spiritual development,
Yeah,
which is self deception.
absolutely.
So the question becomes, how do you not fall in either of those ditches? And what does that look like? I think um there's also something about lukewarmness. So there's a few things as well. I think maybe the key characteristic to lukewarmness is not, because if you say that, you can say, oh, so it's like your faith is 75 and the other person's faith is 90.
Mhm,
Therefore, you're lukewarm and they're not, or something. Like you 50% believe and 50% don't, or something. It
mhm,
doesn't seem to mean that. It's almost like a term that suggests some sort of, I'm about to get to it. Like I'm about to change my life in light of that. I'm
mhm,
about to figure out how
mm,
Christianity
mm,
has something to do with the family. I'm about to incorporate it into work or whatever, right? Lukewarmness seems to be I think about it because I think when you get into, if lukewarmness to you means an intensity of belief, I think it leads to performatism or different problems. And you could argue a lot of Protestantism, the entire Reformation is a sort of claim that the Catholic Church had become lukewarm, that it
mhm,
had
mhm.
actually lost its spiritual heart, and that Protestantism was trying to get back to something intense. And you could argue that the very life of Luther suggests this, and the extreme good works that he was doing before he came to, excuse me, fall more on the side of faith. And then it's interesting because Protestantism as a whole sort of suggests an idea that if the religious life is not individual enough, it will be lukewarm. That there's actually something about collectivity that tends toward lukewarmness. But now we're in an age where everyone wants to get back to community. So is that going to be getting back to lukewarmness or not? And I think that's part of the tensions we're having to think now. Like, and then of course the question is, does the social coordination mechanism allow collectivity that is less prone to lukewarmness,
Mhm,
and
mhm,
it may actually, and I
mhm,
think actually that's what I was going to say there. I do think there are ways that the social coordination mechanism may go back in the direction of collectivity with less likelihood for lukewarmness. We will see. But I guess the main point, I think there's something about lukewarmness, or at least I find it helpful to think about it, where you're putting something off. You're putting it off, and
mhm,
therefore
mhm.
that's why you get cold. You're really hot, and then God, and then you feel like you need to do X. And again,
Mm,
my
mm.
the thing I always bring up is courage. I think fear leads to lukewarmness because you're on fire, and then X is put in front of you to do, and you don't, so you begin to cool. And basically, I
Exactly.
think you lose your fire the longer you put off doing the thing you
Thank you.
fear doing.
Exactly. Yeah, and that's a great I think that's a wonderful framework for it, Daniel, and brings a lot of clarity. And yeah, because that means okay, well, the fact that you whatever it is, right? Like the fact that you haven't written the thing that you feel you
Yes.
ought to write, or the fact that you haven't chosen a church and you feel like you should ought to choose a
Yes.
church. Like all those things are things that and you only know in your own particularity,
Mhm.
but you have to that's where you have to sense. And that's the other thing where I think lukewarm is it's like a two-part thing of like not only is it this idea of like you're on fire and you cool down because you didn't do the thing, right?
Yeah.
And like you said, you out of fear or whatever,
Yeah.
or your insecurities, or I don't know, all of the things, what other people might think of you, et cetera, right? Or what ifs. So that's it. And then the other thing is that there's a like I was thinking about if you stick your finger in lukewarm water, like if you're closing your eyes, you don't. It's I mean, yes, you know that your water got
Hmm.
wet, but like you don't feel much of a difference, right? It's like you don't feel
Yeah.
much of a difference.
Sure.
Whereas if it's really cold, you're like, oh, it's cold, or if it's really
Hmm.
hot, oh, that's really hot.
Hmm.
And it um basically it's there's something about having a connection to that internal that temperature that then makes you do the action,
Yes.
not out of
Yes.
reactivity, but
Yes.
because of that, like I said, that coming from the
Intensity.
well, it's because, like, you feel something,
Yeah.
and you're
The
actually doing
intensity.
something with
Quality.
the thing
Yeah.
that it's just like, water is going to like, when it's why do you use hot water to steep stuff, for tea, like, for infusions versus cold water?
Hmm.
There's all different reasons, but, like, there's kind of a bringing more out in the flavor and in what it is
Yes.
that can be, the tea leaves and all of
Accessed.
that, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. So it's kind of like brings more stimulation to bringing it out,
Mm.
And so there's something about being in touch with the internal temperature and not ignoring it so that you can be prompted and allow that prompting to make you do the thing. Like you said, do the thing, have the courage to do the thing that you are not doing or whatever it is.
Well, it is interesting too. There's sometimes I think that Christians, and I do think this point of lukewarmness applies beyond Christianity into many fields,
Yeah,
but
yeah.
we'll just focus on. There is often a feeling that Christians are more concerned about lukewarmness than evil, actually. Like there's a feeling
Mm-hmm.
that lukewarmness is more of a danger,
Mm-hmm.
precisely because it doesn't have you could just do it for 30 years because it has a certain sort of robotic character to it. Like you're doing your thing. And whereas evil, if you're doing something evil, your life could fall apart and that
Yeah,
would wake you up.
yeah.
So there can be a sense that it's super cold. That would be more likely to compel you into action than lukewarmness.
Mm-hmm.
Lukewarmness has this feeling, I think, to people of this indefiniteness. It could go on forever this way
Mm-hmm.
because it is not too cold and it's also not too hot, right? Um, but of course, there's something very important to actually think in the fact that well, actually, things that are too intense we can't sustain,
Yeah,
and
yeah,
then so actually, how do we make a life that isn't lukewarm that is sustainable?
exactly.
And that, I think, is the million-dollar question that
Mm-hmm.
Christians are now trying to think: how to have a quote unquote passionate life that's sustainable,
Exactly.
and that's going to move more toward like well, quiet work. Like you could say a monk in a certain way. They're not necessarily always putting things on display, but there's a certain well, the other term that and I'll throw it to you. There's something about lukewarmness that lacks focus. There's a lack of attention and awareness, which are McGillicuddy very illic terms, right? You become lukewarm when you're kind of distracted. You're kind of all
Mm-hmm.
over the
Mm-hmm.
place. You're
Mm-hmm.
not focused. But you see, I can't tell how focused you are. But if you're jumping up and down, I can see how happy you are, right? So, like, focus is something that is it doesn't provide the comfort of a determination like an emotional display
Right,
can.
right, right.
But I think lukewarmness could be a term also that is tied to a lack of focus. And I do think not facing your fears makes you lose focus. I think courage and focus go together actually.
Yeah, no, that's all very good. Well, yeah, I think that's very interesting and quite spot on. I was gonna say two things. When you're talking about this sustainability, um, and robotic, because it's just kind of like can be the same, go on
Yeah.
without
Yeah.
it being challenged too
Yes.
much, right?
Yes.
But there's also something though that what to me feels tricky is that it makes me think of Bergson's duration,
Mhm.
like the concept of duration, where like if you're somebody who can be content and you don't have,
Yeah.
you feel quite content again to just sit on the
Yes.
porch or
Yes.
these
Yes.
kind of
Then you
other.
will look lukewarm, but in fact be residing in Sabbath. You could residing in Sabbath can look lukewarm because you're just sitting on the porch doing nothing.
Yeah, or like you're not itching to have to go and do and
Yeah.
be busy and
Yes.
stuff like that.
Yeah.
And so that again, yeah, like you're saying, it can look lukewarm, but you might actually be quite a passionate person,
Yeah.
but because you're passionate about finding the
Yes.
beauty in
Yes.
the mundane or the
Yeah.
everyday, or like this the simplicity of
Mm.
the beauty and the simplicity around you, the profoundness and the simplicity around you. Um, but there's also a way in which you can get, um, I don't know, sloth is too strong of a
No,
term.
you can go into a certain yeah,
Laziness or something
yeah.
like you can, if you like, you can be like, I'm so. I think when did we talk about this? We talked about this at some point. Did I
Mm,
do some little recording about it? I forget. But basically, um, yeah, we probably talked about this when we talked about attention and energy and stuff
mm,
like that. But uh, like here, a very, very real example, vulnerable example. Like I love being with our children. I
mhm,
really enjoy our
mm.
children, and I'm grateful to be like, that's, I don't wanna, like, toot my own horn or
Sure.
anything like that, but, like, I read a really great piece by Yolanda, and she was talking about how, oh, people are talking about how taboo it is to talk about how they are so, like, regret that they're mothers or whatever, and she's like, "That's not taboo. The taboo thing is to have joy in motherhood, to actually, like, be joyful in motherhood."
Mhm,
And like, that's the thing that's taboo, because the most mainstream comments that people will put out there are like, oh, you're just, whoa, that's a lot, or you get
mm,
mothers saying, oh, I can't wait till they go to school or whatever.
mhm.
It's like that, and that's sad, because like ultimately you hate your life, you hate
Yeah,
yourself, and like, I know that's a strong claim, but it's
sure.
true. And to be able to be joyful in motherhood is, that's in a sense become, unfortunately, sort of the taboo.
Mhm.
um uh Really, anyway, so it was an interesting piece that she was talking about, talking about these ideas. But yeah, for me,
Well, if you
there's
enjoy it, you're told you're repressed or you're
yeah,
not looking clearly at the
yeah,
situation. Everyone
yeah,
on the outside has insight that you don't have.
exactly,
That's right.
exactly. So yeah,
So then
anyways,
in the name of liberating people, they silence them.
yeah, well, or, and they make, like, the thing is, for if you don't enjoy being with, like, if you don't enjoy what you're doing, right, either whether that's, if you don't enjoy your husband or your children or your life, like, what are you doing?
Mm.
Like, what are you doing? You made a choice, and now you're not, like, see, this is a lukewarm thing, right? You're not
It's a
fully in your
lukewarm. You're not
choice.
full in. Yep.
Be in your choice and learn
Mhm.
to develop the capacity and ground yourself enough that you can enjoy
Well, I'm glad you said
the
that because
people in, like, your children, your husband, your life, yourself. You know what I mean?
I think that I'm glad you said that
I,
because
and maybe that, yeah, go ahead.
because there's something about lukewarmness that is not giving yourself over to your choice.
Yeah.
Like you're not fully giving yourself over to the thing you chose.
Yes.
You chose it, but then you also are not all in on
Hmm.
it. And I
Hmm.
think if you don't give yourself fully over to something you choose, you won't have focus and you won't have courage in key moments
Hmm.
because you're not all in,
Yeah.
right? So there's
Yeah.
a certain lack of all inness,
Yeah.
which that people go, of course, that's why, but it's a mode of being
Hmm.
in your own
Hmm.
inness. It's not simply an emotional display. It's
Hmm.
an all inness. But
Yeah.
please,
But there's also something where, again, if you can be very content to spend time with your, like, for me, it's like, again, because I enjoy spending time with the children, it does require me to almost have to do something that feels counterintuitive, to do, like, if to maybe to step away. I mean, obviously in a safe way, of course, when they're like, but to step away to do something that, like, how do I put this? It, there is, well, there's just the things you have to attend to in the day, right? Chores or whatever, making meals, etc. Um, but there's something about, like, a lot of it is things that they can be involved with, which is great. That's the beauty of motherhood. There's a lot, very collaborative sort of feeling to it, but also there's a way in which, let's just make it, more concrete. If like, say you are like, okay, I want to get up a little bit early, and I feel like I, need to write this thing. But you're just looking at, like, beholding your child, and you just love looking at them as
mhm,
they sleep, and they're still asleep and you're awake. You'll have to almost peel yourself away a little bit,
mhm,
because you're like, I could just
mhm,
stare at them and enjoy
mhm,
beholding them,
mhm,
because I enjoy just witnessing them.
mhm.
And that's a beautiful capacity. I think that's a really important thing that is really beautiful and wonderful. And you have to still be able to do the work of saying, I need to motivate, like, I need to
Yeah,
sort of
sure.
urge myself to go and do that thing,
Right.
which then won't could take long, could not take long, depends, right? But then it, like, you return back to, in the sense of kind of like homeostasis of your family life and
Mm.
ecology, and your presence with your children, witnessing them in a way that is also what you're doing the work of doing in yourself. Like, it's back to that relinquishing concept that we've talked about with,
Yes.
like, motherhood. But what I mean to say is that, like, this idea of the contentedness, um that you can just be able to be there and be okay with, not just okay, but like grateful, happy, um is is I guess there's like the only, I'm not saying that's a good thing to do, but there's also a way in which you also have to not be like avoiding certain fears
Yeah.
or certain
Yes.
things that feel uncomfortable, because obviously it's more comfortable to just be doing the thing you enjoy, which is,
Right.
looking, you know what I mean, beholding your child instead of peeling yourself away to go
Yes.
write the thing or do the thing and then return. Does that make
Mhm.
sense? So,
Yes.
um, what does that make you think about?
Well, I think it's getting
But it's
at
a tricky tension because there's almost a way in which you're thinking how, and this
but I think it's the tension I guess what I was gonna say, I think it's the tension that has not been thought that has contributed to this, very problematic relationship with lukewarmness that leads to burstiness, that leads to then, like, not doing it, but then it represses because there's actually a part of you that needs that to do the mothering well,
exactly,
and
right.
so then you blow up because you can't think the problem.
And you can't see, like, that's what's so important about
You can't
self-awareness
see
is
the
like,
whole
yeah,
ecosystem.
you can genuinely deeply appreciate your children and recognize
And go write something.
yeah, and the necessary aspect of self-cultivation so that
But
you can
that's the
be more fully
all-in
present to your children,
mentality. It's either you
Yeah,
watch them 24/7 or you don't love them. So
exactly. That's
that's
the brain does that.
yes, so the brain and
But
its everything or nothing can't think the concept of lukewarmness.
but doesn't that seem to be like, shouldn't that be redemptive of lukewarmness, because the all or nothing is the hot
Yes,
or cold.
that's
So
yes.
like what what's
The
happening?
sublation of lukewarmness is dwelling. Like, it's actually dwelling in Sabbath. It's
Mm,
actually
mhm,
like residing in
mm,
Kairos time.
mm,
The problem is that's what I guess the problem is we are responding to our fear of lukewarmness with burstiness or just kind of doing nothing. Like, I'm just going to be all in on watching the
mm.
child. But you see, that leads to a bursting one day because you're not doing the dish, you're not doing the writing. So there's
And you're
something
like,
in
oh, there's
you
an overwhelm of other
yeah,
stuff
yes,
that's
and
not
then
being
you
attended to.
paralyzed. Then
Mm,
actually your quote unquote enlightened state turns into a paralysis,
mhm.
actually.
Exactly.
Because you don't
Exactly.
you're not willing to sacrifice because what you lose whatever you're not willing to let go.
Mm,
And
mhm.
that actually includes the beholding of your children, the beholding of holy things. So actually that the
Well,
return is
and
everything.
that's what's interesting too, like, because if we apply this to beholding the child as beholding God, right? Like, if you in a state of adoration, there's a way in which you have to also, maybe this is in a sense kind of the Protestant thing, right? Where it's like, well, how can you make bread and adore God, like
Yes,
worship God?
that's exactly what we're getting at.
Can you find a way to do such a thing? Because actually, that's still an act of the beholding of the beautiful, if you will.
The so the $1,000,000 question that is lurking behind all of this is how can you do something regularly without then becoming lukewarm? Because basically there's almost a kind of subconscious belief for Christians that it's impossible. If you do a 9 to 5, you will become lukewarm. You
Mm,
must be a missionary. You must do different things. You must have a life that doesn't have routine. Like routine
mm,
is a threat to passion, you could say. But here's the kicker: you cannot function without routine, like, and certainly handle responsibilities. Like, if you need routine, you need regularity to successfully take care of the kids, pay the
mhm,
bills, take care of the venue. Like, routine is critical. But here's the problem: routine trains your subconscious into lukewarmness. So how
mm,
do you do a routine without getting trained into lukewarmness?
mm,
This is, you could say, the $1,000,000 problem.
mm,
And a way that Christians have typically done that is said, well, we're at church on Sunday. But the problem is that can actually itself become a routine. I'm not saying therefore church is bad, but
mhm,
Christians can actually do things to avoid routineness as a mode of being that themselves are routine. And if the
mm,
problem itself is the habituation of routine, then you've got an issue.
mhm,
But that doesn't mean the answer is no routine, because that's then how Christians. But that's when you get burstiness. Well, I'm just not going to do my routine anymore. So you have a burst, and then that fails because it turns out the routines were really important for things to function, and or you throw everything away because you have a midlife crisis, and then you just go back to a routine after some devastation or whatever. So you see how there's this burstiness. So the name of the game is some sort of sublation of routine, where you're actually able to do some things in a routine manner that keeps them consistent, but the way you're doing it actually keeps you plugged up with the Holy Spirit.
mhm,
And the term I want to use is dwelling. Dwelling, because dwelling is an Iliac term. It is Sabbath. It is you're actually dwelling in your moments. Like you're walking. You're not just walking across the yard. You're walking across the yard,
yeah,
right? And actually, when you and here's the key: you cannot dwell in
mm,
life
mm,
in this. You could say capital D word. It's Heideggerian kind of language as well, unless you actually learn to pull yourself away from the child. Like the routine, you can't dwell without the return because that means you're not able to leave your routine or leave the thing you
The home
regularly do.
yeah.
You're not able to leave it, and
Mhm.
therefore it's an idol. Like whatever
Yeah.
you can't leave becomes an idol.
Mhm.
But no one makes an idol of a bad thing. Like I would argue no one makes an
Mhm.
idol of a bad thing.
Mhm.
It's a good thing that becomes bad.
Mhm.
So the letting go, and I guess another way to look at this problem. There's more to say, but I'll throw it to you. The question we have to ask, I guess the Christian has to ask, and I would argue anyone doing culture making work in generally, whether it be artists or entrepreneur even, is how do you not be lukewarm growing a garden? How are you not lukewarm growing a garden? Because you can't accelerate the garden without killing it. If you put a bunch of fertilizer, because what's happening now is people are basically responding to their fear of being lukewarm by cracking the seed open and trying to make the flower
Well,
grow.
that's I'm so glad you said that because actually I think it is the garden, new life. This is why I think actually childbearing and child rearing is a
Yes.
very, very big part of this too, because it's this it's this dialectic between routine and complete you have no idea what's gonna happen.
Yes, and it also is getting at what Aspasia was saying at the net, like holding inside,
Mhm.
dwelling,
Gestation, the
gestation.
gestational,
Yep,
yes,
yep, yep,
yes.
yep, yep.
Yeah. Because there's the and also, I mean, that's why the creative is such a great example of this too, where they don't lose touch with the fire, but they don't control, like they show up to do the work, right? They show up to do it, but they don't control if one day, like to use some of our stories, like, some like Eve will just come
Yeah,
and show up,
yeah,
right?
yeah,
Like,
yeah.
so yeah, it's and to me, that's why there's this like this this constant like ability to, or why it does seem to be important to have this cultivation of a sense,
Yes.
this inner sense of a temperature and what it's prompting you to do, right? What it um I thought the routine, yeah, that's really interesting too, on the routine. And um yeah, because I think there's a way in which, yeah, there's this thought that, like, if I mean, if we really understood every single moment to be like honestly the miracle that it is, then
Yes.
we'd be like, oh well, there's no,
Yeah, well, dwelling is a commitment to
yeah. Oh, that's what I was gonna
doing
say.
that.
That's what I was gonna say. Dwelling is good, and I think that's probably a helpful term for this kind of sublation of
Yes,
lukewarm, which is actually then the this beautiful dynamic
yes,
between the hot and the cold,
yes,
right? Um, but I was thinking about why, to me, and it kind of relates to our convivial
yes,
Renaissance talk, but this is also why I think, though it doesn't sound as like kind of lovely and almost holy as dwelling, but consistency and
yes,
building.
that's part of it.
Consistency and building, because like the thing is, it's like, again, we just have no tolerance for like the concept of kaizen in Japan, right? This little baby steps.
Yes.
But that's why, again, child
Mm.
raising, like that's why the seed, the planting, the garden, like why is the Bible so steeped with these metaphors? Why does Jesus come
Yeah.
in a womb? Like it's because it's like these tiny, tiny, tiny incremental things that build and build and grow and then unfold. And it is life itself. And I guess what I mean to say is like this concept of building and trusting the little things, and the little things that you can continue to build is so crucial to, in my opinion,
Yes.
um, actually not being lukewarm, because uh yeah, it to me that's in greater touch with the pulse of heat or cold. And
Yes.
also the idea of like being lukewarm is that you also could possibly become indifferent in a bad way,
Yes.
like,
Yes.
whereas, or kind of like not invested,
Yes.
right? There's no kind of skin in the game, but all of this is the skin in the game.
I
And it's
mean,
something that you can also see as a product of that very dwelling, or that very consistency, or that very, yeah, again, not to be redundant, but building. So go ahead.
there is something about lukewarm that seems to suggest you have no skin in the game. You have no
Mm,
like skin in the game,
yeah.
right? You're in the game, but you don't have any kind of deep involvement. Yeah. Again, to tie it to the social coordination mechanism, the argument could be, well, I would argue that we have not had effective social coordination means by which to increase the probability that a person's routine doesn't lead to lukewarmness. I think it's actually difficult to dwell. And the idea of the distinction between lukewarmness and dwelling and routine and all these things is hard to think.
It is
And
hard to
it's
think.
hard to have a means of meeting people and talking with people to make the distinctions intelligible and to make yourself live according to them. I think it has been very difficult for most of history, like you're talking like pulling your way from the children and having a talk like this that you can record and
Mhm.
have other people speak with. Like it was very expensive to do videos and very difficult to set it all up. Now you can do it for 5 minutes. So and you can do it very quickly. And then the amount, let me put it this way, the amount of costs and time it took to do that little bit you needed to do in order to return to the children in the fullness, and this logic would apply to anything, it's become much easier to do that. So
Mhm.
I think we now have coordination means to help us grasp what dwelling is, because I would argue we've not had an effective coordination means for those little things you were
Mhm.
describing that actually are necessary for the full
Mhm.
gestation. So
Mhm.
so therefore it makes sense that you could say many Christians are skeptical of routine, skeptical of 9 to 5, because for most
Mhm.
people those have indeed habituated them into lukewarmness. There has not been a means by which people can teach themselves how to have routine that is more like dwelling, how to raise a garden and not be lukewarm.
Mhm.
That has not been something that people have figured out how to do well. And we haven't figured out how to do well socially and communally, because I think that gets into coordination problems, which I do think we are now facing and dealing with. But please.
Do you think that was I mean, it's funny though, because the skepticism of routine as making somebody lukewarm is kind of funny though, because it also relies on the routine of church
But that's what I was saying is we've
as
responded to the problem of
as the way
routine.
to not be lukewarm,
But
right?
that's the problem is the way the church has arguably, and this is where I think the skepticism comes, in the way that Illich was like, you can't deal with the problems of planning with a plan.
Right.
Right. You
Yeah,
can't
yeah, yeah,
deal
yeah.
with technological essence with essence. We've dealt with the problems of the
Root.
habituation of routine with routine. Now you could argue going to church is it's not the normal routine. It's the one out of
Exceptional
seven
thing.
days,
Yeah.
the exception. So therefore it's less like a routine than the other routines. And you could say that's better than nothing,
Yeah. Yeah.
but arguably it can fall back into the same kind of habituation
Mm,
if you're not careful. And
mhm.
I think there's a lot of people that feel like it's done that. And but then of course if you say, well, therefore the answer is no church, well then you get all the problems that come from that.
Yeah. And also, I mean, just to like to say that um yeah, the 9 to 5 being a risk that could make somebody lukewarm. Um yeah, I think that is very real. But I think that if we understood it as, again, this dialectic between the
Hmm.
externalities and the inner work, then we could be like, there's hope to be able to not be lukewarm as just a kind of regular,
Yep.
average
Yep.
person,
In
you know
the
what I mean?
dialectic.
And
Yep.
average person, I mean, everybody's
But then
average, but
but then again, what people can respond to the 9 to 5 is saying, well, everyone should be an entrepreneur, right? Being an entrepreneur is terrible. You take work home with you. It can be very, very difficult. And so the 9 to 5 can be a wonderful thing for people, especially to get started, to get their feet under them, and to do their entire life if they're happy with it. There's nothing wrong with it at all. But you
exactly.
notice how even like you hear people today saying that, the loss of the 9 to 5 due to AI is an opportunity for everyone to be an entrepreneur. To me, that's burstiness. We're just going to respond with a burst of everyone being an entrepreneur as kind of inspiration, unless it translates into a dwelling. No, 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 no. That's not going to
That could
necessarily.
crush people
That
like
will crush.
hard.
It will crush people, and there's much more to be said. But basically, I guess what I'm pointing to, and I know we don't have much time, but there's a fear of lukewarmness
Mhm.
that has led to over-indexing outward quantitative signs of not being lukewarm. That has also set the stage for bursty
Mhm.
strategies. But the opposite of lukewarm is not hot, like boiling hot or performative activities, but
Or icy cold.
icy cold, but a sublation into a dwelling, a mode of dwelling that actually it entails an attention,
Hmm.
focus, and courage on
Hmm.
spirit.
Hmm.
And if you and that's starting to get at it, I think.
Yeah.
And investment and having skin in the game.
Yeah, absolutely. And to think about dwelling as like, maybe people might be like, well, what do you mean by that
Yeah.
exactly? Like,
Yeah.
I mean, obviously, there's been other really great talks. I think I'm sure you and Matthew Allison have both talked
Yep. Yeah, yeah,
about
yeah,
the
yeah.
topic, and
And
it's
there can be other terms. I mean, we're in the age where I think we're learning to use language more analogically because that's, I think, ultimately what language is, looking at Hofstadter and others, where now what we're actually talking about is more of the thing being pointed to by the terms. And funny enough, there's always been this problem of how do we have people who are different talking with one another if everyone has different languages. I
Mhm.
think dwelling in the analogical dimension of language is how we're going to get something more like a universal language without, killing all languages into a single one, which has been a dream of, say, business with English or something like that. Now, that's a lot larger conversation, but I think we are, and Master Pietro was pointing to this. There's something about the way language is being used now that is gesturing toward riding the analogical wave that words are all kind of participating in. But anyway,
Yeah, no, I agree with that. I mean, I think that to me, though, I was thinking about dwelling and the concept of lukewarm, and another association that I can draw out when it comes to lukewarm is if you were to draw a bath, right? So if you have a
yeah, yeah,
bath
yeah, yeah,
and you're like, when the water kind of gets like
yeah,
lukewarm and you're just like,
yeah. I don't
let's
want
let's
that.
let's
Yeah,
let, let's add some hot water, please, right? So I guess what I mean to say is like I know it can maybe seem like frivolous and kind of unrelated to being like like I don't know, a good Christian, or like to be somebody who like loves God with all their heart and lives for Him. But there is something about enjoyment that's really actually crucial,
yeah.
because like
Lukewarmness lacks joy. There's a
you
yeah,
don't want to stay in it if if the water's if you don't typically want to stay in the bath if it's lukewarm.
yeah. It's interesting with your example because like it would seem as if the lukewarm is someone who's in lukewarm and doesn't mind. They don't want to add hot water. They don't want to add anything, and there's almost something kind of problematic about that
Yeah,
or
where they don't
odd.
enjoy it.
Yeah,
And it's kind of like, do you enjoy your like? That's why I think
yeah,
I know it seems so, but it's actually an important thing because I don't think that I think there's a lot of confusion around this as well because all we think about it or a way that enjoyment can be thought about is just kind of the base pleasures, right? But it's
yes.
though there's something good about pleasure. It's just that it's misunderstood that to think enjoyment means like being like self-centered or something like that. But actually being able to like really to me, dwelling does have to do with enjoying. It has to do with like not only enjoying the life that you are in and have created, but also allowing, like, creating a space and an environment of dwelling that other people can enjoy too. And to me, like, again, you are going to enjoy a hot bath more than you would like a lukewarm one. And that's why there is something about enjoyment that seems important. And I think, like, just one last thing really quick. I think a lot of the kind of, and I don't want to knock it too much because obviously there's been a great role in evangelism, right? But like there's something about the I don't know, there's something about it where it's almost not sure what to do with enjoyment. Like it's either enjoyment where the Christian suddenly just kind of does basically more or less what other people do
Yeah.
with their spare time, which I'm not judging that. I'm just saying like it's not sure what
There's
or
confusion. It's
yeah,
it's
or
not
you
clear.
shouldn't be like you shouldn't really if you're worried about something being enjoyable qualitatively, you're not really focusing on like
Jesus
what really
or something.
matters. Yeah,
Yeah.
exactly.
Yeah.
So I think there can be confusion there, but I
There's
do think
endless
just to draw out this
confusion.
interesting and like metaphor, well, an analogy and kind of other meanings to lukewarmness, I think again, the hot bath makes me think of like what do you actually want to remain in, which is dwelling. So I'll
I
turn back to
mean,
you.
I know we're out of time, but
Mm.
I think it can't be overstated. It would seem to me, at least, that a very large amount of people's thinking about Christianity actually does reflect a concern with lukewarmness. Because when, for example, I think when people call themselves evangelical, it's like a declaration: "I'm not lukewarm." You
That's
know,
right.
I'm not because I'm evangelical.
Yeah.
Or even when somebody says I'm a fundamentalist, they said I'm willing to look silly in the eyes of the. They are basically are saying I stick to fundamental things even if it costs me. Therefore, I'm not lukewarm. And I think many Protestants, when they think Catholic, they think lukewarm because they're just going through the motions,
Yeah.
right? Now, that's a
More Protestants would
caricature.
think that they're not lukewarm because they believe like they're all in with the way
Yes,
that they do rituals or their sacraments,
that's
etc.
correct. So there's a very large amount of judgmentalism that
Mhm.
happens in Christianity that in the background has lurking the concept of lukewarmness. So and yet it is a concept that is not necessarily thought about or
Mhm.
poked on,
Mhm.
which is interesting. Um, I think also I wanted to say is that basically lukewarmness may be and seems inevitable if you never face the judgment of joy, like that we talked about
Yeah, yeah,
before. Is
definitely.
that, but then of
Definitely.
course the judgment of joy can destroy you.
Yeah.
So the Christian, and I think everyone ultimately, has a problem. You either face the judgment of joy and risk being overwhelmed and destroyed, or you inevitably become lukewarm.
Yeah.
There is no way to avoid the judgment of joy, and
Mhm.
not end up lukewarm.
Yeah.
But people's like, well, I'd rather be lukewarm than be destroyed by the purgatory of joy.
Yeah.
Well, that's why basically lukewarmness without courage is inevitable,
Yeah.
because that's an act of courage to face the judgment of joy. So I think a lack of courage leads to lukewarmness inevitably.
1000%. And I just want to say really quick, like, we're wrapping up, but um, yeah, absolutely. And I think that this is why I think it's important to think about this term even outside of the concept text of Christianity, because you can certainly get lukewarm in your life because you're not, again, you're not allowing the judgment of joy to purge you into becoming who you really are becoming and can become. And so, yeah. And also, I was thinking about this idea, like I was saying before, about the lukewarm water is usually stagnant, right? So, um, it's it's to me, that might be interesting. That's important too. I think with the concept of lukewarm water is again like the stagnancy, and that's why if you're like there could be something where like if you're feeling, and this isn't to like suddenly again go into fear mode and be like like I'm a
Yeah.
I'm lukewarm, oh no, what's gonna happen to me, but you just want to be in touch with that. Like if you're feeling stagnant, that might be an indicator that there's some sort of lukewarmness going on for
Yeah.
you. And what is it that you can get back in touch with
Mhm.
to in order to be able to cultivate that sense of the dwelling, because a dwelling is not going to feel stuck.
No,
the
no.
the the the
Even if
dwell
it's repetitive in the sense of a
it looks,
consistency and
yeah,
routine.
yeah.
That's right.
It's a dwelling. It's the fullness of life itself.
It is very difficult for us to not assume routine equals stagnancy, because we're trained by quantitative measures, by what we can see, right? But
Yeah.
that's part of the problem
Mm,
and leads to basically a church is, I think, notably in Protestantism, that cannot help but basically treat Christians as kind of failures who aren't
mhm,
missionaries, or doing quote unquote evangelism, right? But this creates a bursting, split, confused church that then there's a lot of issues. And yeah, look, I think many Christians, it's not really that Christians worry about other Christians being lukewarm more than
mm,
unbelievers, right? You
okay.
talk about the unbelievers of the world, and you'll be judged by the world. But when you talk with other Christians, which most of the time many Christians have self-selected to just be around other Christians, then you get a, a kind of surveillance for lukewarmness. I almost want to say, like. Almost a red scare, like who's a communist, who's lukewarm, and who's not,
Yeah,
kind of
yeah,
thing.
yeah,
Not to
yeah.
push that too far, and I think that just shows a certain, not a certain lack of certainty about the concept and
Mm.
what it is pointing to. And so I appreciate you bringing it up.
Yeah, just really quick uh on that. I think that if people aren't just with Christians, that's also the where fear of lukewarmness can come
Sure,
in.
that's true, because you're like, I must not be a real
Yeah.
Christian
Well, or like
if I'm hanging out with these people and they're okay with it.
or like, oh, well, like, am I evangelizing enough? Like,
Yep.
if they haven't converted to Christianity, like,
Yes.
have I done my job? Like,
Yes.
am I
Yes.
really
Yes.
loving and caring this other person who I do have a
Yes.
relationship with? If I'm not certain that they're not like going to go to hell, so I think there could be a lot of fear about your own
Yes.
lukewarmness in the midst of difference versus being able to, and I don't know, maybe say, well, what is the, like, how should one, what disposition should they have? I mean, to me, that goes back to, again, like, this is why the inner cultivation is so important, because again, that person's not going to church. So you might go, you're going to church should hopefully help feed into your own capacity to be able to be a person of dwelling with that
Yes.
person,
Yes.
right? Does that mean that, and then you say, well, does it, that's where I know
But
there's
then
so
you
much
want a
there. There's so much there
quantitative.
because there's like it gets into like conversation
Yes.
abilities, like, or energy,
Yes.
playfulness,
Yes.
whatever, all the things like,
Which the church is not
laughter.
thinking, because it's
Yeah.
looking for quantitative
Well,
measures.
yeah, and
Yeah.
if you're thinking about those things, like, it's just simple. Like, just give them a tract, and if they
Yeah.
don't,
Yeah.
then
Yeah.
I
Why are
don't
you
know, just
making it
maybe try again in
complicated?
3 weeks
Mhm.
or something. Because like, what
If you're
else do you
making
do?
a
Like, what,
there is
or
a
just
s
ignore it and kind of just hope. I don't know. Like, you just hope that maybe you keep praying for them and they'll like have a kind of prodigal
the
son moment or
I'm
something
well, I'm
like that.
glad you said that, even though I know,
Yeah, so I know there's
I think many Christians conflate complexity with lukewarmness. If you make it complicated, you're lukewarm,
1,000%,
and
1,000%.
simple equals passionate.
Absolutely.
And
Yeah.
this has been a disaster, because it is not simple, and it's because I think what can happen because of that nervousness of Christians hanging around people that not what they do is just quietly select themselves out to be around people they don't have to feel that tension with. And that
Mm.
actually kills the spread of the gospel. Like that's actually in the name of being faithful to evangelism, what it practically looks like is Christians avoiding places where they have to face those existential tensions. So there's not kingdom building work, but
Mm.
in the name of being faithful to the kingdom,
Mhm.
it's so there's not culture making.
But that's also where quality is gonna matter so much because, again, that person's not gonna go to church. Maybe you've invited them or something
Yes,
like that, but let's just say they don't, right? Or they
yes,
won't. But what they could see and what they could experience is literally being in your presence,
yes,
right? Or being in the dwelling.
yes, yes,
So that's gonna matter so much, and that's why, I way earlier talked about like this concept of lukewarm or whatever having to do with how do you relate? How do you
yes,
relate to yourself and to others? Because
yes,
like it's gonna show like I think it is related. I think it is related how, how this concept of the scripture on lukewarm don't be, not being an admonishment
yes,
about being lukewarm would also have to do with your capacity to again um have a certain subjectivity cultivated that's
yes.
going to impact the way you relate to other people. Like I just don't think that's ever I've not ever heard the concept of like being lukewarm with God as to how do you like how does it well maybe it's done in the like are you proselytizing but how do you actually like engage with those around you, probably even the people you most engage with because that's where you can most easily get irritated and frustrated.
I
You
mean,
know what
it's
I'm saying?
well, what I was about to say, and it would be a very large claim, but there is, I think, an argument to be made that actually not dealing with those tensions leads to lukewarmness, like avoiding people that make you think those existential questions. Like, actually, I do think that avoiding difference or steamrolling difference with your tract policy actually leads to lukewarmness because
Mm,
you're not being challenged. You're not being forced to think things you never thought and face
mm,
anxieties and fears, actually.
mm,
And I guess I want to say to the Christian, like, when the Jehovah Witness or if a Muslim say, are you going to go to the mosque? Are you going to go when they hand you their tract? Are you going to do that? And you say, well, that's different. Not from their
not from
perspective,
their perspective.
right? And furthermore, I would hope that when I encounter the atheist, that they are the best of all possible atheists. I would hope the Hindu is the best of all possible Hindus. Like
Mm,
you would want that precisely because that may. I actually, in a very real sense, I'm not sure if Christianity, from our position, being our position, I'm not sure if it can be the fullness of itself,
mhm.
except in the presence of the Hindu being the best of all possible Hindus,
I
the
see the best
Muslim
of
being,
all
yeah,
possible or like that's anti-lukewarm in the sense like
yes,
that's the
yes.
antithesis to lukewarm is the best of all possible
Yes, we need
Christian
everyone, but this
Hindu.
is what
Yeah.
the social coordination mechanism makes possible. I think it better coordinates bringing, realizing, and bringing together the best of all possible versions of X, whatever that may be. We don't know ahead of time, and bringing them in contact because the theory is that the only way to get the best of all possible versions of every possible worldview and to see which ones can handle the anxieties of our age, technology, and so on is precisely in that refinement and then
Exactly.
connection and then see what happens.
Exactly.
And so that's what we want to help facilitate, in my opinion, that's what we want to help facilitate. And that Christians should therefore take on cultural and social strategies by which they can realize the best of all possible versions of Christianity, which nobody knows ahead of time. You have to go through the testing and the work, which you can't think of yourself. So you have to encounter otherness to be
Mhm.
surprised by it. And then all other worldviews do the same. And then those things all connect. And it's almost like a kind of worldview natural selection, if you will. There's a kind of evolutionary sort of principle here. And I don't think we can realize the depths of beauty and humanness unless we do a process like that.
Mhm.
And
Mhm.
I, um, I think basically there's something about lukewarmness that for me is inevitable if you don't engage in that process.
Mhm.
Because another term for lukewarmness may be fragility, like you're fragile.
Fragility. Yeah, yeah.
You're lukewarm in the sense of you run into tension and you break. Now, I don't think that's exactly what the term lukewarmness is getting at, but it's interesting how Christians are very concerned about lukewarmness, which is also just very interesting how that's a term that just comes up in the book of Revelation. I mean, I'm not saying it's not echoed throughout, but fragility is another major threat. Like maybe even more of a threat that people's
Mhm.
Christianity is fragile. That's why they all got deconstructed, in the 2010s or whatever, right? They had a fragile Christianity,
Mhm.
religion. Perhaps it wasn't lukewarm, but it was fragile. And actually, ironically,
Mhm.
extremely fiery Christianity might be more fragile. because it hasn't learned to dwell. It's not
Mhm.
sustainable. You get
Mhm.
these passionate people, and then they deconstruct, right? So, in the name of avoiding lukewarmness, you may create the conditions of fragility,
Mhm.
right? And I would say fragility is a kind of lukewarmness, quote unquote,
Mm,
because it's
mhm.
not able to engage in the stakes or the more serious things. Now, that again, I'm not saying they're identical, but I actually do think Christians can avoid lukewarmness in a manner that makes them fragile, and then they deconstruct. So we Christians have to stop, and people in general have to stop responding to lukewarmness with strategies that create fragility. And I think that's happened.
Yeah, that's all very good, Dick.
But I know we're out of time.
It's
Uh,
a it's
it's
it's a
it's
very
great.
live topic for me, so I appreciate you being willing to
Well, I
entertain it.
do I do think the social coordination mechanism can help with the problem of
Mm,
lukewarmness.
mm,
Because again, I mean, nobody plans to be lukewarm. Nobody
mhm,
intends to be lukewarm, right?
mhm.
But I
Yeah.
I would argue, but it happens. So
Mm.
why does it happen? Well, I think coordination problems are part of it as well.
And I'll just say really, really quick. I know I keep saying that, but one more thing on Corey Malloy and what she's doing a summer challenge for women, and that was really transformative for me last summer. Anyways, very, very cool, and she's sharing like testimonies of people. But to the dwelling point, this woman was talking about how suddenly in implementing new habits and new orientations to life and herself and her awareness of her own beliefs, she feels like she has so much more time in a good
Yes.
way. Like
Oh
she
yeah.
can
Oh yeah.
actually enjoy time again,
Mhm.
and it's like this pleasant surprise that you feel like an expansion in the day of your time, and
Yeah.
it's just like there's
Yeah.
a
Yeah. Yeah.
qualitative difference,
Yeah.
and I'm telling you, like, having things like this happen, this is what the internet is facilitating, is like women
Yes.
sharing these
The
stories of
social
like,
coordination mechanism.
oh my
Yes.
gosh, this is changing things in my life, and
Yes.
this is possible, and people like, this is so crucial because yeah, it's so crucial because actually being able to give people hope and show people that there's a way and that this is something you can do and that this is possible. um it's so huge because it has so many ripple effects to the society, families, the economy, I mean, really.
Yes.
So yeah,
Well,
yeah,
I
because
would
love is at
also.
the center of all of that. It's like to love your life, to love
Yes,
time
yes.
itself, not to want to
Well,
kill time, but to
w-
love it
one
and to enjoy it. So
characteristic
yeah.
of routines that are in service of dwelling increase time. They give you
Mm,
more time,
mm,
not less, actually. Like they open up
mm,
space, and you want to think about: Does this routine increase time or make me
mm,
busy? And unfortunately, I think many people, and Christians notably, respond to the fear of lukewarmness by being busy. And you
hmm.
already alluded to this, but here's the
Yes.
problem: busyness makes you fragile. And that's why I do think a lot of responses to lukewarmness are fragility. And you could have routines that make you fragile because you never
Hmm.
create time to actually face yourself and do the inner work, right?
Hmm.
So a good character, as a good kind of heuristic, look at your root, look at one, see if you have routines. If you
Hmm.
don't, that can be a problem. Um, but then if you do have routines, ask, are these making time and simultaneously training me to be able to use that time well? Right?
Mm,
Or do I get through my routines and then I'm looking for the next busy thing to distract me? Well, that means that routine is not training you to
mm,
use space,
mm.
open time well,
Yeah.
right? So I think those are some
And the
heuristics.
feeling I have, like with you, even in doing these types of
Yeah.
conversations or the other
Yes.
wonderful people we've met through the social
Yes.
coordination mechanism, how we describe it as almost like a timelessness,
Yes.
like,
Yes. That's
an
key.
hour goes by, but
Yeah.
it felt like two
Just
minutes.
like that.
So then
Yeah.
maybe could somebody say, well, more time, isn't that like a timelessness that you're trying to
But
kind of go after?
that's
But the
the
irony is
yes.
like you could do, I could,
Yes.
like, there's this feeling that I don't want this to end. I want
Yes.
this to keep going
Yes.
because
Yes.
there's
Yes.
a amplification, like I was saying, the expansion that it is felt
But you
regarding
need
time that
yes.
is so important. Most people, like, unfortunately, a lot of people just like, it's almost like they hate like
Yeah, they want to
it,
kill time.
yeah, like
Oh
that's
yeah.
literally
Oh
the
yeah.
expression.
Boredom. Boredom.
And so it's just like we want to try to do things and cultivate ways of living that are about wanting to like embrace time, to enjoy
It's a
time.
major
This is why
problem.
the
A
yeah,
sign
yeah.
of
And by the way, you could
lukewarmness.
see these testimonies like on
Yeah.
Corey's Instagram page. It's public and it's great. Yeah.
A sign of lukewarmness is boredom. If you
Mhm.
get bored, then I would be concerned about lukewarmness. But then you'd be like, no, no, I did all this passionate Christian stuff. It's like, well, if there's boredom, then there's a lack of dwelling.
Mhm.
Now, again, it depends on what you mean by boredom, because there's also people can use the term boredom
Right.
to mean open time where
That
daydreaming
space for yeah,
happens.
yeah,
Now, I'm
yeah.
talking
Mhm.
about the Patricia Sachs invented boredom appearing in literature around the Industrial Revolution stuff. That's what I'm talking about, which is this existential state
Yeah, yeah,
of
yeah.
I want to kill time. you're not bored unless you wanna kill time. The feeling of wanting to kill time is the characteristic of the boredom I'm describing, which is bad. If you're, like, have nothing to do and sitting around, you say, "I'm bored," but then you're actually daydreaming, you
Mhm.
don't wanna kill time, that's not your I would not use the word bored for that.
Yeah.
But boredom is a sign of lukewarmness, but also the great, like, revelation is that periods of open like, you need time in order to have experiences of eternity. And
Exactly.
if you're always
Exactly.
busy, you don't have time to experience that because time, I would argue, is always already participating in eternity. We're
In the
already in
dwelling.
eternity. Yes,
Yeah,
in
yeah.
it, but dwelling is experiencing time as eternity, which is what
Exactly.
it was
Exactly.
always already. And
Exactly.
retrospectively turns out it was always that.
Yeah.
But you have to be able to access that experience, which
Yeah.
is what the right conversations and so on does, is where but you can't have that experience of eternity, dialogos, timelessness, flow unless you face the fear of being bored.
Yep.
Unless you face, and there will be times where you are bored because you have to go through that existential purgatory and you will
Mhm.
want to kill time, but you don't. Like
Mhm.
if you never go through times where you want to kill time, but don't, then you never get to the place where you can dwell in time as eternity.
Mhm.
So if you keep yourself busy to never face the feeling of wanting to kill time, that can be a problem because it's actually those experiences that can direct you via authentic resonance and intuition and other stuff we've talked about with Seth Aspasia and others. It can direct you toward the thing that you in particular can be trained by to learn how to dwell in
Mhm.
eternity.
Mhm.
Maybe it's poetry, writing, walking, etc. But you will
Mhm.
be directed
Mm.
in when you face the fear of the feeling of killing time. When you face that experience, you then create a clearing where you can be directed toward the thing that
Mm.
will train you into dwelling in time, dwelling in eternity.
And a lot of that is just also this is the we talk about trial and error, like this
Yes.
testing ground. Yeah, that just picks
Yes.
if you just if there's something that you're feeling a kind of sensation
Yes.
toward, do it.
Yes.
Just see what
The
happens.
intuition will take you through the testing. And I
Mhm.
would actually argue even the things you do that then later you don't do was necessary to experience, so
Exactly.
there's not doubt later in mind that you should have done that. You gotta actually go through this whole process of trial and error to remove plausible
Mm.
deniability about the other things that you end up not doing but did for a little bit, precisely so when you get to the thing of your absolute choice,
Mhm.
you're able to give yourself fully over to it. And then you'll find that actually all the other things you did are inform that.
Informed that, yeah,
Yes.
yeah.
But for more by OG Rose, please visit ogrose.com, X, uh, Twitter, X, whatever. Amazon, all purchases of books are deeply
Yes,
appreciated,
and reviews.
and
Deeply
reviews, a
appreciated.
huge deal. Instagram, and all the other things. And thank you so much for your time.
Thank you for your time.